Hi everyone, welcome to DocuSpace Season 1, Episode 1. I am your host, Ravi.
And I'm your host, Joseph. We'll let our guests give their introduction.
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm an architect living and working in London and interested in cultural contexts and designing for different cultures.
And I'm Yimeng. I am a urban designer to be, had an architecture background and enjoying designing the cities and stuff like that.
And a recent graduate, by the way.
Recent grad.
Amazing. I guess we'll give a quick introduction for ourselves too. Joseph, live in Charlotte right now, originally from Ghana. And I'll probably be relocating to Cambridge soon to take over Imang's desk at grad school.
Harvard, you guys. They're not name
Woo!
dropping. Hi, I am Rabi. I'm from Lahore, Pakistan. I don't have much else going on. Wait, no. I work as an architect in New York City. I enjoy making films. I enjoy watching films and lots of other things as well. And we're really excited for you guys to join us. And you guys will be seeing Imang and Jack in our future episodes as well, alongside more guests, very
Yes.
wonderful people. Joseph, do you want to talk about
Yeah,
just the
so we'll get right
episode?
into the subject matter of today. So today we'll be talking about context. Tell us what's the context. And I guess to start, we're going to give some context on what this show is about, DocuSpace. So we're just going to be mostly talking about what we do as designers, artists, creatives, like Rabi's in film, and Jack has things he does outside of work, and I'm sure Imang does as well, and how all those interests culminate into what we do in our livelihood. Yeah, and I guess the easiest context that we can talk about is a little bit about our work and how we think that architecture, art, and design affect everybody.
Yeah, does anyone want to take the floor with a context or a space that's important to them?
Yeah, I'm sure. I think I've mentioned to you before. So I really love the Barbican estate in London. And a bit of background to me is, I've lived in London for more than 5 years now. But I grew up in rural countryside, so then it was a bit of a move to the city, following kind of usual education in the UK. And I really love the Barbican because it offers all the things that city life offers. The Barbican estate is a brutalist estate that was built in the 60s and 70s, and it doesn't attempt to fit in. It's concrete structures. But what's really amazing about it is the sort of the social agenda behind it. That was social housing, but also providing music venues, swimming pools, leisure, and that was the original function, and that's what it's set out to do. And then to this day, there's a whole kind of culture that's built up around it, and where people can live and kind of holistically go to all these things. But beyond that, people from the city come to the Barbican for a lecture or to see a film or to see a theatre performance. And for me, coming from rural parts of the UK into the city, that kind of embodied and like continues to embody the reason that I live in a city like London. So there's lots of interesting things about the Barbican.
And I think it's interesting that we're starting brutalist architecture because of how divisive it is for people sometimes. I think I'm not sure where people lie on that, at least in this conversation, but I think generally people in the public tend to not like it, but that's not like a blanket statement, right? Like Barbican is a great example of how it actually can work. So I think brutalist architecture and just different architectural styles really depend on how they executed and how people relate to them. And I think that's why context is important because depending on where you are, people will have different relationships to the built environment and how they attach meanings and values to it.
Yeah, I think Barbican
it was not
great.
well received. Also,
well received. Barbican is a great introduction to the topic of context because now that it's been there for so long, it itself kind of becomes like a context for a lot of readaptation. At least that's what I heard of. Jack can correct me if I'm wrong. But to me, I think context is important in a sense similar to, well, actually opposite to what Jack's background is. I was born and raised in a city, a mega city, in Shenzhen, China, which is has a population of what, like 14 million people. So I think that until I left it and receive my education here in the US and, you know, become urban designer, and then I was like, I would probably not have done that, the same path, if I had not have a city so close and dear to my heart. So I think that in itself made a lot of decision for me. Just a context where I kind of grew up. I feel like usually outside of design, people will call it nostalgia. We kind of call it context. So that's something interesting I found.
But also, even as designers, we call it nostalgia sometimes, and I think there's also the word pastiche. There's different levels of wanting to copy something or take influence from it, and I personally try not to step into pastiche in that you're working on a dwelling, but you don't copy the cottage down the road necessarily, because we come from a different time to when that was built. We have different built methods of building, and we have different needs as people. And I think like the time that we live in is very important, because equally with the building that I love, the Barbican, if I was given a luxurious brief, like the brief that the architects in the 60s and 70s were given to design the built Barbican, as much as I love the Barbican, the end result of my Barbican would not be, you know, massive concrete high-rise structures, because times have changed. We've become more more aware of the climate crisis, and also we've learned from some of the urban planning mistakes of that time. So even though I wouldn't then if I was building, I still wouldn't want to copy the immediate context. Maybe I would want to take influence from how the Barbican has worked so well and has sort of stood the test of time in being a cultural center and a real like node from the city. So in contrast to just like a copy paste, there's a real challenge for designers to take the best of what is around us.
Yeah, context is kind of like a teacher, learn from, right? But you can't copy your professor.
And Jack, I really love that you brought that specific narrative up, because I think something I hear a lot is people are like, I really like old architecture, like, you know, Gothic or Baroque and like decorated architecture. And they're like, why don't we do that anymore? Like, it's so nice, it's so pretty. And I think that's exactly what you've highlighted really well, is that the times have changed and the context by which people were making those things have also changed as well. And Ima, to your point too, I think it's really, really like well stated how you put your upbringing in a city and how it's influenced you're going to urban design. Because I that's exactly what we're trying to explain here. It's like your context really does have these really either big or small influences on you. And I think that one for you, at least, like you're very self-aware of like how that has influenced your passions. But I think sometimes people don't really understand just how much it affects them. And a really easy example in the States is, you know, looking at the history of like redlining and how highways were built to marginalize smaller communities. And those are things that trickle down to today, where those communities are still separated from resources. And, you know, while that was made by one person or two people, like Robert Moses, I know had like a really, really huge legacy doing that, like building highway bridges that were too low for buses to go so that people can go to the beach, and separating people in that way. Those are all things that are not even just like part of that contextual time, but they still affect us now, right? Like people, those generational ripples don't go away. And those are things that, you know, I think it's very cool to know as an architect, but I think it's something that people should have access to, you know, understand how those things have affected them.
Yeah.
I mean, Robert Moses and the work that he did affects people to this day. Like I go in those areas as living in the city, and I'm like, this hurt the neighborhood deeply, and I can see that. And this kind of reminds me of this philosophy almost that I was reading about in some indigenous cultures, that when they make a decision, what they think about is the 3 generations prior to them, the current generation, and the 3 generations in the future. So when you make a decision, you're looking at those 7 generations. And I think that's a practice that we can begin to embody, because that is context. The people that are going to inhabit a space is the context, and they're so important. Yeah.
Yeah, infrastructure is always going to live so much longer than ourselves.
Yeah.
And same with the cities, and same with the ideas, like the modernist idea and the modernist way of building long outlived Le Corbusier, and was also didn't only do damage to wherever he was building, but the ideas kind of spread to other cultures, or were imposed on other continents or places on the planet.
Which is the introduction of colonialism and imperialism. I think especially like in my research and just my own interests are definitely rooted in the effects of globalization, and that's something that it's very easy to pinpoint, like, you know, what this looks like here and there, but it's hard to unroll that, because like you're saying, like that becomes part of like a culture and a way of thinking. And, you know, being from Ghana and having visited after I left like at 8, and I visited like maybe 2 years ago, it's crazy to see how much the country's changed and how we're picking up these cues from Western cities and trying to morph ourselves to fit them, even though it doesn't make any sense where we are, right? Like concrete in the hot suburban areas, this doesn't make sense. And the way that those villas are built. And part of that is because it's become a symbol of wealth, a symbol of status. And it's very hard for people to unroll that, because now, even though it's not from that context, it's become part of it, right? Like it's become part of how people live and how they see themselves. And so it's like, I think as someone in architecture, it becomes a question of like, do we then try to roll back these beliefs and these new systems, or do we try to work within them and still make it work? And I think that's kind of something that makes it a little bit harder to correct, because again, now it's not necessarily that you can say it's a bad thing, because the people might disagree with you, you know?
Yeah, it comes back to the pastiche thing. Like you don't roll it back in such a way that you appear to be like deprogressing, because you know that actually in a lot of cases, colonialism has become part of many nations' story, and there's ways in which a nation has to, like could be able to build on that and make it their own, with, you know, progressing and seeing how it's not succeeded so well in other countries, and actually they're using that as an opportunity to make it their own, or like correct what's not concrete in hot countries not working.
Yeah, I think that's well, at least that's my optimism in that, is that hopefully, you know, given that at least in Ghana, like given that it's still developing, there's time to correct what has already failed elsewhere, and not just repeat those mistakes. And that's not, you know, to denounce the technology that, you know, has been developed, but is to, you know, think of smarter ways to use it. And, you know, not just like, okay, we have to copy this aesthetic style and we have to make sure all the skyscrapers are here, and we can't have any street vendors in this area because we're gonna have tourists there, or we can't have people sitting outside in this area, so we're gonna gate off all these buildings, right? Like those are the moves that I think become a little dangerous with that obsession of like trying to get to this Western status quo. And it's also really a huge disservice to the people, because they have their own specific ways of life that are being ignored and overwritten with this new trend.
In a sense, is that the two contexts are not respected equally, in a sense.
Yeah.
We're prioritizing certain contexts or habits derived from a more globalized or modern way of building, which might not be the best in the given context of the climatic or the cultural. That reminds me of a studio that we're previously in, where we're discussing in the American cities, whereby there's the Highway Act that does so much harm that we talked about to the inner city neighborhoods. But then the solution is not so much as to remove the highway and then just build the exact same neighborhoods that we sort of pay tribute to the back, in a sense. It's more so, what now that the damage is already done, there's is part of the context now. What do we do to envision the future? In a sense, given so much has changed in transportation technology, in the neighborhood dynamics, economics, can we put EV back here? Can we make it more sustainable, more prone to flooding, instead of say, let's build it back to exactly 100 years ago when before the highway was there. So I think that sort of ties into what Joseph was saying about the old and the new context, and how do we sort of work together toward building a future instead of an old image. What is that word again, Jack?
Pastiche.
You think he said?
Vestige. There you go.
Yeah. But also, I mean, essentially Rabi's challenge with looking 3 generations back and 3 forwards, you know, it's easy to criticize 3 generations back for not seeing our needs, but the challenge comes at looking 3 generations ahead.
Hopefully
like
we don't
needs
get
to us.
criticized 3 generations later.
Exactly.
That's our
I
goal.
mean, we will be. I don't think
Will
we're doing very
be.
good.
It's inevitable. It's so true. Yeah.
I think the idea of colonization also brings up, just as coming from as a person who's come from a nation that was colonized, I think what this brings up for me is just the idea of history and how that's written by the victors. So there's like a lot of stories that are untold, that are just not there. So and there's stories that are told more than others. So naturally there's things when we look into as designers who are in supposedly a context that we're unaware of, that we are more privy to. And it becomes very important then to think about what's not being told, and kind of be aware of that too, or try to be contextual. And I mean, this is the hard, being contextual is very hard. Getting all the information that you need to put into design, to be ethical, to be careful, to be respectful, is something that's very hard to do. And I don't think we're doing good jobs as a designer, but I am designers yet as a whole, but I think there's hope, and then that's maybe something we can work on. And even with like buildings becoming more like Western in some way, I feel like a lot of what we're losing is personality in a weird way. Like there's homogenization, and I walk in the streets and I'm like, why does this look the same? I mean, I'm an architect. I mean, I have knowledge to tell buildings apart. And if I'm looking at it and I'm like, this is not it, it's not it.
Yeah. I mean, like if you look at most of the major cities across the globe, they kind of all start to look the same. Maybe different shapes, but it's like same material palette, same color palette. Maybe they have more lights here, or right. And okay, so to shift the conversation a little bit, I think we've been mostly focusing on the cultural, societal aspects of it, but you know, context can also be very tangible, like the physical situation of things. And I think part of what we've learned, at least in school, especially, was like looking at the context in terms of like, you know, daylight patterns and climate and geology and things like that, and how that affects how we build. And I think that is also a part of the problem of how context maybe sometimes gets lost, because when you're building the same thing everywhere, then you start to rely on like other things to make it work, right? Like if you're building non-insulated glass boxes in like New England winters, you're gonna have an issue that requires you to, you know, either really cool it a lot in the summer or really heat it up a lot in winter, right? And that starts to get into the problem of like how architecture needs to become accountable for how we stay sustainable.
Yeah. And I think as well as those other things that you mentioned that shape the physical context that we're building, like also the rules and regulations play a big role in determining how things look. And I would say in London, and I guess the UK, but London's particularly, where there's very rigid planning. The rules imposed in planning force a certain type of like aesthetic, and particularly appeal to like developers who want to build a lot of housing quick. The solution to a sort of getting through planning as quickly as possible is to build a brick, a concrete frame, cavity wall, brick finish. It can be brick slips or real brick, but that's the like it's been taken as a kind of template and copied around the whole city. And actually, London as a city is a very varied in terms of architecture. It has like a very varying skyline. You get high rises, and you also get townhouses. And actually, what it's moving towards is the same block with like a gridded brick facade. And I think that's a massive shame. I think buildings with more personality create landmarks, they create public spaces around them. And really it's within the capabilities of our planning system that you can interpret the rules as long as you comply with regulation. You can interpret the rules and arrive at something that looks completely different to something else. But I think we're losing that, and I think there's a negative effect on our neighborhoods.
I think in that sense, I also resonate deeply with the fact that our planning document also needs to be more contextual.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of time it's like it's a long-term tradition where if it works, don't change it. A lot of time be like that.
But even so, like, who does it work for too, right? Like, it works for
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I was working on a school design in Shenzhen, which is in South China, but the regulations for how far apart or close together the buildings can be for schools is migrated from North China, because that's where the planning regulations first came about and then got deployed to the whole country. And then mind you, like that's 2,000 kilometers apart or 3,000 kilometers apart. And then it ends up with the same kind of design, which does not work in a sense, given how, I guess, tropical South China is really. So yeah, that was just something that if we can use a little bit more context and less follow in the trend. But then, yeah, in a sense, the planning documents also need to adapt. And unfortunately, it's doing a lot slower than designs.
Yeah. As well as like the location, they need to be specific to location and also to the generation. These legislations take so long to change, and we, become irrelevant to the current generation.
Absolutely.
I think what that brings up for me is this very interesting question of like there's certain, oh my God, we've used the word context so many times, but in certain
situation, place.
Sure. But in like certain places, certain contexts become more important to study, I feel, because there's so much. There's like historical, ecological, geographical, geological, sociological, ethno something, whatever. And I feel that's where what Imang was talking about earlier, that your personal, or your context or where you grew up influence you as a person, and all design is personal. So I feel like you personally, or I at least am personally a little bit biased. Like I always look at historical context more, and guilty as much as I should be looking at, like ecological. Like I look at it, of course, but not as much. But sometimes you can tell, like for the Barbican Center, I feel that maybe the surrounding context, immediate context wasn't as important, but they understood the sociological context, and then they produced a building that works. It doesn't look like it would work when you look at it from far away, but when you go in, you're like, oh, it works. And in that way, it's really interesting how sometimes buildings become contextual, but in a very implicit way. Like they're not screaming it, but they're there. And I've given this example before, I think, to Joseph, that I live on Roosevelt Island. Please don't stalk me. I know no one is going to, but and then we have this like real funky looking subway station, and it's like this pitched half roof, and every single time I passed by it, I was like, what is this? What's going on? And then this one day I was passing by it at a certain angle, and all of it made sense to me because it was kind of following the slope of the structure of the bridge that's right behind it. And I thought that was so cool. And oh, that's why the designer did this. And the stars somehow align. So I think that also becomes really interesting in some ways. Like you can be smart about how you're dealing with context. Yeah.
And I like that you said that design is not inert. And especially like, I think when I first started architecture school, not having any exposure to architecture beforehand, I kind of went into it thinking design was very, rigid. Like there's like good, imperatively good and imperatively bad design. And only through education and exploring other things did I start to understand that what good and bad design is considered to be is very different based on like where you are and what you're prioritizing, right? Like you're saying, some people might prioritize like the historical context, or some people might prioritize the environmental one. And to that note, actually, I think the best type of sustainability is longevity, right? Like if you can make something that lasts really long, right? That's actually the best type of sustainability, where we're not like constantly tearing and rebuilding, or we're falling out of love of the style. And this is something that actually trickles into like a lot of other fields, like even in fashion, right? There's like this thing about fast fashion where people are subscribing to this idea of like, you follow the trend, you buy the clothes for this very short period of time, they're not good quality, they won't last very long, you throw them away, you buy new ones, right? And so then that prioritizes speed and efficiency over actual quality. And that's something that architecture is actually suffering from a little bit too, right? Like we're not thinking to build things that will last maybe 3 generations, right? Because we're doing it so cheaply and so quickly that if you really need to, you can just rebuild it, right? And what matters more isn't even the building, it's the land value itself. And that's devalued architecture in a very strange way to me. But to get to the point about how design is more personal, I think if we're going to change that trend, we actually need for the cultural image or the cultural importance of the built environment to become A, more conscious, and B, more defined. And I think right now, with how undefined it is, at least for the people, right? Like I think I see people like complaining, but they're not like getting quite at like what the problem is. And that's why I think it's important to have this conversation with people, right? Like I think architects need to actually start talking to people, because people can actually make things change. And unfortunately, we're bound by regulation, but regulation actually needs to reflect, people, right? Because if you're in city planning, you're in a city elected office, you should be doing what the people want. And the rigidity of zoning, especially, it's so hard because it was made in a time where, at least in America, like where industrialization was happening. So they need to sequester the factories and all the pollutants from the people. And then to make that work, now you have to put roads and highways to connect everybody. And now that works for the car factories, right? Or the car companies. So now we're doubling down on the cars. And then you get into situations like Charlotte, where as someone who likes to walk a lot, it's impossible to walk here. It's actually like a risk factor. Sometimes you can't cross the road for at least like half a mile. So either you risk it or you walk further, cross it, and then turn back around, which is just completely backwards. So yeah, I think like those threats that you guys were mentioning definitely like ties to, at least for me, what I think is probably going to help move things a little bit forward is people need to start becoming aware of these factors
Not
more.
just aware, people need to start talking to each other.
Yeah.
Industries need to start communicating. I was talking to this friend recently, and she was in the cycle of applying to grad schools, and she got into many different places. And what she realized was that these schools are not talking to each other, which sounds so ridiculous, that you have similar programs, but you're keeping your knowledge gated in a weird way, and that's not going to help anybody. It's not helping anybody. So it's just not just within schools, but industries need to talk to each other. And that's just the beginning of trying to solve a problem, which may be unsolvable at this point. I sound very pessimistic today. I'm sorry.
No. Really funny story about industries, really quickly. So I've been working, our firm was working on this renovation for a restaurant. And I think I posted this in my story because I was literally losing my mind. We were talking to the building department, the plumbing, electrical, all these departments. And I kept on having to go from one person to another because this person says, you have to change this part of the building because it doesn't work for my code. And I'm like, well, I can't because the other guy told me that it needs to work for his code and I need to do it this way. And he's like, well, that's not gonna work for me. Then I go back and tell the other guy. He's like, well, actually, you need to do it this way because this other guy. I'm like, can you guys actually just talk to each other? You're literally in the same building. Why am I trying to piece it together for you? And at the end of the day, me as the end user is the one who's struggling. And I think that is a good example of what Ravi's actually getting at here.
Yeah. Also I think the fast fashion is a good example of like we need to learn from other industries, like maybe the automotive industry that has more sort of fabrication skills, and okay, with the fast fashion we need to learn how to like build for more longevity. In London, I think a building built in the post-war period would last 60 years. The current building stock that we're building in London has more like a 30-year lifespan, which is horrific. That means we have to build it all again, and we're building in high carbon materials like concrete and brick, but that longevity isn't coming through because of cheap developments with cost cutting, and something critical to the building industry is going wrong there. So we need to learn how to I think one of the major problems with our industry is that we have such a slow cycle of learning from our mistakes, because it takes so long to build a building, and then you don't really learn anything until after it's been operating for a few years. And by the time you've done that, you're already onto the next kind of cycle of another 1,000 homes. But we kind of need to learn more from our mistakes immediately, not after such a delay. And there is more and more of a push towards in the UK, the RIBA calls it post-occupancy evaluation. So really like continuing the architect's appointment beyond the handover of the building, monitoring the performance of the mainly kind of more of the quantifiable characteristics of the building, but I don't see why that shouldn't continue into the social and the contextual, and how is the neighborhood being built in this development? Has it excelled, or has it even met expectations? And I think like other industries are able to move a bit quicker on assessing and improving their revolutionizing how the product goes out and influences people.
Yeah, in a way, our field is so reactive that we always, criticize like, oh, maybe this the architecture critique as a field is also very popularized. But we're very reactive, but I guess like Jack said, could have used it in a more reactive, more faster fashion. Yeah, that's very interesting. You mentioned the post-occupancy valuation. I think we're definitely getting into something there.
Hopefully, yeah. I guess we'll kind of transition to maybe the final part of this. So yeah, we'll just be sharing some thoughts about what we want the audience to take away from this conversation. So final thoughts. I guess I'll start first since I'm already talking. I guess from my end, I think it's very important for, as Rabi sort of alluded to, like for us to have more of a participatory system of architecture, whether it's within the industry, whether it's architects talking to other architects and talking to other industries, or architects talking to people. And the post occupancy thing, I think, is a great idea in terms of like pushing towards not necessarily doing something and leaving it alone, but I think also inviting people into that, because I think that will allow for more conversation on questioning why things are how they are, right? Like I think before architecture, I would never question why all the houses are in one place and all the things are, I assume that's how things are because that's how they need to be. But it's, it's a decision that people have made that ideally would be to benefit how we live. And I think because of how largely rippling these decisions are, it becomes even more important to make sure that we're really reading the pulse of what people need and how people will react, because like the Barbican, if people will love what you've done, they will maintain it, and it will naturally just be cared for, and the stewardship will be there. So we need to start making things that people care about, I think, more, and to do that we actually have to understand what people want. So that's I guess my 2 cents.
Great. Design needs to be human-centric. Very important. So yes, my 2 cents, I need to tell a story first. In my 2 cents. Well, it's not a story. It's about like how I learned English, and I've mentioned this before also. But in our English exams, we used to have these like comprehension passages, and and then we would have a bunch of questions that we would have to answer, and one of those questions would be like, what does this word mean? And it would be a very difficult word somewhere in the middle of a passage, and to tell the meaning of that word, we had to read the passage, we had to read the paragraph, we had to like think about the character's feelings, read the sentences before and after multiple times. And I feel that is what we should do as designers when it comes to context. We need to just be hyper aware, very sensitive, and it's important that we do that. The second thing I wanted to emphasize is just like us regular Joes need to like be more aware of our context. Just be more aware of our surroundings, where we are, what's our neighborhood like. And when you're more aware, you will know that you have a certain amount of agency and you can exercise that agency. And knowledge is truly power. So just like educate yourself a bit more about what rights you have where you are and where you can potentially be.
Yeah, and I think Tori's point is that part of exercising it is even more important, like figuring out how you can enact those things.
Yeah, I was going to kind of build on that, and that I think the message that I'd convey to non-designers is to encourage kind of more participation in sort of consultation events, but also that to know that it's not necessarily limited to the fabric or the color of the brick, or like as Rabi said, there's agency in the communities that surround developments, more so in some places than others, but where it is appreciated and recognized as important, like the community's opinion on something, you know, the community's demands can go as far as to, you know, be public space. It can be more social or programmatic parts. You know, there's developers want to know, or should want to know, what do people think a neighborhood is missing, or what is a city not providing them. So I think that's something that as a designer I'd like to hear from more like non-designers or people in contexts where I'm working, and then to designers in a similar kind of fashion, like when you're building to the certain context, it's not just about what's next door, it's about how next door works with the door after that, or what's the wider networks of the context that could enrich and design even more than taking a material palette or something like that.
I guess my final summary would be directing both to designers and non-designers in a way that we talked a lot in terms of how we think of the way we think of context is also changing. That Rabi, I love your way of saying like we think 3 generations back and 3 generations before. I believe that was not the same even when I started architecture school. So the way we approach context is constantly changing. And then just like we talked about this before, but like treating context as your client. But knowing that your client can change, your client, the way that they think or their demands could be different day by day, given how fast-paced our society is right now. Environmental degradation, climate change, inequality probably was not the topic that was on the paper or the RFP 30 years ago. So recognizing that this can be really changing day by day is something that we ought to be all aware of.
Yeah, being susceptible to change also, I feel so important in such a fast-paced world. And then how do you be susceptible to change and then contextual and continue to be contextual for 3 generations? There's a lot of responsibility.
Exercise.
Yeah. With that, thank you everyone for tuning in. You're gonna see our wonderful guests Simang and Jack again in the future episodes. We hope you guys join us for the rest of the episodes. And with that, please hydrate today. Thank you very much.
Yes, and please continue the conversations elsewhere.
Yeah, like, subscribe, and
everything.
everything. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. See you guys later.
Thank you.
Bye.